Good and welcome to tonight's shiur. This is Motza Shabbos Parshas Boy, and tonight's shiur is dedicated to a little boy who had his opshare last Sunday. His name is Yisrael Aryaleib Katz, whose parents happen to be my daughter and son-in-law. And I've been asked to start with a Chassidish Shemaisa, so I want to start with an untypical Chassidish Shemaisa. This is a picture of the celebration of the opshare, and this is in a place in Buffalo Grove, which, for those who don't know, is a suburb of Chicago. It's a retirement home, and people who want to downsize, many of them are quite capable, but downsize and don't have to worry about mowing the lawn every week, etc. And so, over the last 10 years or so, my daughter and her husband have slowly been building up contacts in this home and giving shiurim regularly, and bit by bit built up the trust. It's not necessarily a Jewish home, but there's about 30% are Jews. I just want to tell you an example of how distant from Ma'aser HaMitzvahs. So they had bagels on the table, and so they prepared wash stations. So I filled up a cup, kvort, to wash the yadayim. So an old lady comes next to me and she says, what's this for? So I said, I'm washing for bread. Oh, so she takes my mug, and she dips her hands in it. And she washes her hands, rubs her hands, and then goes on to serve herself whatever it was from the buffet. So I thought, at least I say nach never, ad kadei kach, not, such distance from education. And they have the ad kadei kach that in the last year, the management of this retirement home allocated for them a use of an apartment, and a spacious apartment, which they're doing. So there's a weekly shiur, and 14 people coming to a weekly shiur, as I say, people who have very, very little Jewish education, and bit by bit, they're hearing about Ma'aser mitzvahs, and so this is my Chassidish Ma'aser for tonight, and this is talking about the Frierdiker Rebbe, Yod Shvat, and the emphasis of Loi Yisborich Diro Betachtoinim. And so the Rebbe emphasizes the Betachtoinim, and the Frierdiker Rebbe emphasized Ma'aser B'Poyel, first of all in Rabbonim Halacha B'Ma'aser, to educate Rabbonim Halacha L'Ma'aser. That's one area of Tachtoinim in the spectrum of Torah. And then his Mesiras Nefesh to have Moyalim, Shochtim, Mikvois, again, L'Ma'aser, that people should be able to enable Kiyum Mitzvahs L'Ma'aser. And then on the aspect in education, Kepshuta, in the union of Chinuch HaKtanim, and the Rebbe says how you'll go today, this is a sikha from 40 years ago, you go today in the street, you'll meet someone who's as a shaykhus to Yiddishkeit, and you'll very often turn out, they'll say that because 20 years ago, 40 years ago, there was a Melamed who sat in an attic or in a cellar and learned Torah with him or with his father or his Zayda, and with this Mesiras Nefesh, so kept the embers of Yiddishkeit alive in the communist Russia. And so that's the part of the Dira B'Tachtoinim. So here's the other end of the spectrum. People who lived a whole life, and Chayr did well, Gashmias, have very, very little knowledge of Yiddishkeit. And that's another element of Tachtoinim in helping them, inspiring them, educating them, Geschmack in Torah and mitzvahs. And so wish them Hatzlocha and Mazel Tov for the opshare of Yisrael, who took the mic and said some of the 12 psukim, and to the delight of all those present. Okay, so we'll go on to our first a question on our list, and that is using a coffee filter on Shabbos. So some of us may remember this tea strainers, where before tea bags were necessarily invented. So you would buy tea in a packet, loose tea, and then you had like a little sieve, which would you'd put on top of your teacup, and you'd pile in some tea leaves, and then you'd pour from the boiling kettle through the tea leaves, and that's how you made your tea. So could you use that on Shabbos? And the same thing is here. It's a coffee filter where you put coffee granules. I guess it's not instant coffee, it's the roasted coffee. And you put in granules and you'll pour boiling water, and the water will seep through the granules and it'll become a geschmack coffee. So is that okay to do on Shabbos? So the first reaction is no, you can't do that on Shabbos. Well, it's not so posh at all. So yes, if you've got some liquid which has got impurities in it, and you want to strain out the impurities. So you can pour. So you're not on Shabbos. You're not allowed to strain. You're not allowed to use a sieve on Shabbos. It's one of the Lamates Melachos. Boirer, Zoyre, Meraked. Boirer is selecting with picking out the impurities with your fingers. Zoyre is using the wind power, and Meraked is using a sieve to sift flour, to sift out impurities is not allowed. The same thing to use a strainer to sift out, to strain out impurities in a liquid, that's not allowed. Absolutely. Here's a different story. Here, the tea leaves or the coffee granules ain't going nowhere. They're sitting comfortably and snugly inside this thing. They're not. There's no mixture here. Just like people who use a tea bag. I'm not talking about lifting out the tea bag, but using the tea bag. The tea is. It's not. The tea leaves are not mixed in with the liquid. They stay securely inside the tea bag, and that's fine. There's issues of bishul, but as far as straining, when you use a tea bag, you're not straining. You are flavoring the tea, the water, with the tea leaves. So let's just read what Rav Porkash says. Now, Rav Porkash has got 5 volumes of Shabbos Kahalocha. The first one focuses on bishul. The second volume focuses on boirer. So that's what we have on the screen. Misnenes or misanenes, a strainer, which is you have in it alete, tea leaves, or sakiote, or tea bags. So he says you are allowed to pour hot water over those tea leaves. Of course, you have to deal with the bishul aspect, and therefore it can't be kli rishon, and better not kli sheni. So the question put to me was, can you use a kli shlishi and pour hot water from a kli shlishi through the coffee granules in a strainer? And so same thing as the tea, don't see any difference. And he says, although the water does absorb the tea flavor from the leaves, but that doesn't constitute boirer. So same thing, tea leaves, coffee, granules, if they are sitting in a strainer, pour water through them would not be an issue of boirer. That would not boirer, not meraked, and it would be okay. Right. Let's move on to our next question. If a person is in a hotel for Friday night and they want to check out on Shabbos morning, otherwise they stay after 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, they're going to have to pay for another day's stay in the hotel. Typically, though, you go to a hotel, you will probably have with you a phone, you probably have a wallet, you may have muktza stuff. So how do you deal with the muktza stuff when you check out? The actual, your case, your bag, you can often leave in the lobby. Or, they have a cloakroom. You can check out and leave your bag until Motzei Shabbos. That's not a problem. The question is, what do you do with your muktza stuff? For that matter, I just actually on Friday, I was sitting in the Beis Torah and I saw there's a booklet being published for guidelines for people in hospital over Shabbos. And this would be, and they deal with the same question. Let's say a person is in hospital and they will likely have a mobile phone with them and perhaps other muktza stuff. And if they are discharged on Shabbos, and all right, so the one thing is how to get home. but we're dealing with what to do with the muktza stuff. So the guidance is you put it in a bag before Shabbos, and then it's bosses the dover osama to the bag has got muktza and non-muktza, so you're allowed to move the bag. And that's not so poshut. Okay, so we're looking here in Hilchas Muktza. Let's do this patiently. We have a concept of if a muktza thing is left on a surface alone, then that surface becomes muktza too. And that term is called basis ladover ha'asur. So let's say I've got here a little coffee table and I have my telephone sitting on it, one of those old things with wires, So that table becomes muktza for Shabbos because it's a basis ladover. The telephone is muktza. The table which supports it, if it's just the table, just the telephone, that would make the table muktza b'pashtus. That's called basis ladover ha'asur. So the muktza muxifies the bosses too. However, but if that table, that coffee table, let's say, is being used for before Shabbos, we put on it non-muktza as well as muktza, and the non-muktza is more choshev than the davar ha'asur. That's an important point. Putting a sweet in English, on a tray together with a Shabbos candlestick, which costs, by the way, nowadays, as you're talking about over $1,000 for a pair of silver candlesticks. So it's not, I don't think a candy, as much as I love candy, is not more choshev than $1,000 worth candlesticks. So that's not going to be enough. All right, but if you got the davar hamutar and davar ha'asur, or the davar hamutar is more choshev, then that protects the bosses not to become asur. And therefore, you are allowed to move the bosses even when the isur is still on it. Okay, so far so good. Bosses the davar asur mutar, you're allowed to. Hello, however, you have now a table which has got on it a muktza and a non-muktza, and you have a heter to move it, but if you can shake off the isur tzorich lanari mitchilo, you're going to have to shake off the muktza. And then you'll move it just the heter. So if you have, let's say, a tray of fruit, let's say, and there happens to be a muktza stone on it. So you are allowed to move the tray, but if you are able to somehow shake off the stone, that you shouldn't have to carry the stone, just the tray, just the fruit, then you'd have to do so. If it's not possible, or by shaking off, it's going to cause a loss, damage to the davar hamutar, then you're allowed to leave it there. Now, I'm emphasize the davar hamutar. And here's my question. I've got here a bag, and I'm able to shake out my mobile phone. There's not going to be a hefsed to the davar hamutar. The davar hamutar is safe. The davar ha'asur, I don't want to leave my mobile phone over there. It's got all my contacts and all my whatever. Yeah, so I don't want to leave it there. But why don't I want to shake it off? Because I want the davar ha'isur. So then, what's the heter to move the bag together? True, it's davar ha'isur v'amut. But I have a chiyuv l'nair. I have a chiyuv to shake it out. That was what I was looking up. But the common guidance is to do what I just described, to leave it there, to put it lechatchila even in the bag before Shabbos. It should be basal davar mutar. But let's read further. Another heter for not having to shake out the muktza is that if you shake out the muktza, it's going to defeat the purpose of why you're moving the bag. You're moving the stuff. You're moving the box with the fruit. You need the space clear. So you have here a tray of fruit, and there's also some rocks. If you're going to shake off the rocks, you need the place clear. You're moving the tray with the fruit because you need the space. You're going to leave the rocks there. It's going to defeat the purpose because you want to clear the space. Then you want to use the space. If you shake it off the Isur and drop it over here, you won't be able to finish off. You won't be able to use the space which you're trying to clear out. Therefore, so I'm trying to take the liberty of doing this a little bit further. So I need to check out of my hotel room. Now, if I would leave my phone on the floor or on the shelf in the hotel room, then I haven't checked out properly. It's part of the shleimus of checking out is that I shouldn't leave any of my personal effects there. So it's not mamish identical, but that I'm seeing here. Sorach lefan is mekayim. I need to clear this. I need to clear my stuff out of this space, and therefore it may fall into this second category. I'm allowed to move the Easter as well as the heter, along with the heter, because I need the space. I need to clear the space. Anyone has a better explanation, a better heter than that, I'm happy to hear. Right. Someone asks me about the tea bag, about then to take out the tea bag. I'm not sure what the question was. I mentioned about tea bag in a strainer. That was what Rav Forkash was talking about. If you use a tea bag in a regular cup without a strainer, then, I'm talking about shlishi, then you'd have to lift the bag with a spoon rather than just lifting the bag with a string or with your fingers because of schita. When you pinch the bag with your fingers, that's one more of schita. Even if you have a string attached and you lift it, so that as you lift it, there's kind of a pressure on the bag and it's going to ooze out a little bit more essence into the cup, which is again a problem of schita. So therefore, if you do use a tea bag on Shabbos and with a shlishi, and you want to lift it out of the drink, you should do so with a tablespoon or something. Let's move on to our next question. Okay, so here, a common question is about tearing stuff on Shabbos, tearing material. Now, what was the practical question? That a person is worried that the cholent in their crock-pot is getting burned, perhaps too dry, and the heat is too intense. It's going to burn the cholent, which is okay, fine. So now, what do you want to do? So they want to put little spacers. So they want to take some silver foil and roll it into little balls, and then put little balls of silver foil, and that will create a half an inch, a quarter of an inch space, so the heat will not burn the cholent, which is a practical thing, a good idea. But are you allowed to tear foil off the roll on Shabbos? That's the question. So let's read the Alter Rebbe's Lashon here in the Sim Shin Mem. Shin Lamentes and Shin Mem are kind of what we'd call miscellanea in melachas, bits and pieces of various melachas which don't have a full simon dedicated to them or more. Ava pisha chatichas tolush. I want to explain. The Alter Rebbe has a chiddush that tearing the melacha of koireya means to separate it at a seam. So where you have cloth which has been sewn, and so to separate the seam by the hem or in the middle, to separate at a seam, that is koireya. But to tear a piece of paper or to tear a piece of plastic, she doesn't talk about plastic, to tear, let's say, a piece of leather, a piece of parchment, the Alter Rebbe does not see that as the melacha of koireya. Bear in mind that melacha of koireya has got to do with toifer. Toifer is the koireya amnas lasis state firis is the opposite. So the Alter Rebbe does not see cutting a piece of paper per se being a melacha, unless you have a specific measure, and that comes under another melacha, which is mechatech. Let's say if you're making sandals out of a sheet of leather, you'd cut the straps to a particular size. So cutting stuff to size, that is mechatech. But if you're not interested in particular size, it's not mechatech. And therefore, tearing off a bit of silver foil off a roll is not mechatech, because you don't mind a little bit more, a bit less, it doesn't matter to you. However, if by tearing you're making it now more useful, more usable, chayiv mishum tikun keli, that's considered tikun making a keli, im mechatche besakin. If you do it with a knife, shalei besakin, poter avaloser. So just to dramatize this, if let's say I want to blow my nose and I've got a hanky which measures 1 meter square, not very convenient. So I want to tear off from this huge hanky, paper hanky. I want to tear off a smaller piece which is more suitable for blowing my nose. So to do so, if I'm using a sakin, if I use a scissors, could be tikkun min haTorah. If I just tear it, says poter avalosa. So tearing, the same thing, paper on a roll or silver foil on a roll, to tear off a piece to make it more convenient for use, that is considered v'taken keli. And therefore he says you're not allowed to tear paper in order to use it for specific use. Mipnei shehu k'mesaken keli. And he gives a reference to Simtov Kufches. So now, I don't see any difference whether you tear off a piece of silver foil to cover a dish or you tear off a silver foil to make it into a ball. It doesn't matter. It wasn't a roll. It wasn't suitable for the purpose which you need it because it's on the roll. You're tearing it off, and now you'll use it, whether in a flat or crunched, for a purpose. So I would say no, you wouldn't be allowed to tear off the silver foil to make it into a ball. I've got a simple solution. If you have a knife with a metal handle, all metal knife, so then you put the knife inside the base of the crock pot, and the knife will be the space, so you don't have to start crunching silver foil. Actually, we've been doing this of late. We've got some old nutcrackers, the old metal nutcrackers, which are outdated, but you're using them for spacing so that the kugel doesn't burn on the blech. So you put these metal nutcrackers and they create a little bit of space, and everyone's happy. The kugel's happy, and we're happy, and Baruch Hashem. Yeah. Okay, let's move on. Point number 4. Very common question. A doorway which starts off wider and then becomes narrower, and it's a deep doorway. So here's the question: where do you put the mezuzah? On the wide, as you can see on the picture, we've got a brick doorway, and then goes in, I don't know, whatever the measurements are, a couple of tvochim, and then there is a wooden door frame, and let's say there's a door there, although it doesn't appear on the picture. So where does the mezuzah belong? And what's the dilemma here? On the one hand, we have the idea of the mezuzah should be tefach hasomuch l'reshus harabim. It should be on the outer tefach. So that the mezuzah, and that's the way it's brought in halacha, the mezuzah gives shmira, gives protection, and it should give protection already from the first tefach. Hasomuch l'reshus harabim should give protection to the house. On the other hand, what is that called Pesach? And there's this sefer which I've mentioned many times, a sefer dedicated to mezuzah called Seichel Tov. He brings some who say to put it on the outer thing, but then his conclusion is from several poskim. No, and let me explain. A Pesach means a space where you can walk through. Now, at the bricks level, let's say this Pesach where you can walk through is 1 meter wide. At the wooden architrave level, it's 90 centimeters wide. So effectively, this Pesach is not 1 meter wide, it's 90 centimeters wide. So the wood frame, the door stopper, whatever you want to call it, the door stopper is the extra piece of wood to make that the door shouldn't swing all the way through. So that's the normal way with a regular wooden door. So that is part of narrowing the Pesach, and that's where the Pesach is. And before then, it's getting to the Pesach, but the real Pesach is the narrowest part of that doorway. And therefore, the place for the mezuzah is really at the narrowest part of the doorway. That is the Pesach. A couple of points. Now, a there's a discussion in Poskim about putting a mezuzah on brickwork. There's a lot in the Gemara in the Sugya Menachos Pisches Shimoi. Is it correct to put a mezuzah on directly on the masonry? Sometimes you have no choice because that's all you have. That you have a Pesach and it's just brickwork. But there are those who say that's not really chayiv mezuzah, etc. And that's another reason why not to put the mezuzah on the brickwork, but to put it on the wooden architrave. That's not my main reason here. It's just the first reason I said the narrowest part. Let's see what we have over here. He quotes here from David Jungreitz, who was the Avest in Shalayim. He put it on the Mezuzah Sa'etz, even though it was more than a tefach away from the Shusarabim. Chovas Hador quotes him, and he says the fact that the wooden architrave narrows the Chalal Pesach, that therefore the outer is no longer called Pesach. And because here Avnei Nezer, another point according to the Rambam. According to the Rambam, there's without a door, it's not chayiv mezuzah altogether. Therefore, the mezuzah should be where the door is. And then he says perhaps one last thought. True, tefach hasamach lepesa halushus rabim. That's the ideal, but here that you might actually be missing out on the mitzvah by putting in tefach hasamach lepesach. So you're going to sacrifice the need to be tefach hasamach lushus rabim, and so that it should be as you see over here, it should be the narrowest spot. It's become also often I pass by houses where they have like panels by the sides of the door. A panel could be 9 inches wide, and it's a glass panel even. And the Balabatisha thought is, well, that's all part of the Pesach, and let's put it at the end of the panel. And really, it should be tefach hasomuch l'chol. That it should be the mezuzah should be within a tefach of the space where you can walk through. Let's now see what we have here on the chat. Should there not be balls of silver under the crock-pot container in the first place? Good question. Should there not be balls of silver foil, you mean? I'm sure, not just silver, it's a bit expensive, under the crock-pot container in the first place. As I mentioned, there was a Pidyon Ben just last week, and they asked me about the price. How much do you think 100 grams of silver costs today? It worked out in the region of £200. It was a shock to me that the price of silver has shot up so high. But the Alter Rebbe has a shiur about. All right, let's come back. So now, if you want to put up a cholent, which is going to be less than machal ben soy, then you're going to have a problem of you need to have a blech of sorts, and that's where possibly putting a bit of silver foil underneath would solve the problem. If you want to do chazorah, but if your cholent is more than machal ben soy, then you can leave it in the crock pot. You don't have to put silver foil balls there. So some will say because of hatmona, but that's because it depends on how much space there is between the ceramic and the metal housing. All right, let's move on. Obviously, this person who asked the question didn't have silver balls there before. Okay, yeah, for hatmona. So it depends on how close it is. I know some poskim were quite concerned with the removable inserts, a problem of hatmona, but of ames of hevel. Others say there's a little bit of space there, and therefore it's not hatmona. Okay, let's move on. I know Rav Forkash has a discussion about it in his sefer, but that's one other time. Okay, clay cafe. So actually, this question came from somewhere in Europe, and there's a Jew who's on his way to becoming Shomer Shabbos, should we say, and he owns a clay cafe, and it's a popular pastime. You bring kids, whatever, and you bring them to the clay cafe, and they've got ready-made mugs, bowls, whatever, made of clay, and the customer pays money, and then they take paint and make a design, and then they give it back to the shop, who then will put it in a kiln, and 2 or 3 days later you come and pick it up. So here they're asking, do these dishes need to have tevilas kalim? Do they need to be toivled? And he's asking because he runs, let's say, a day camp, and part of their, they'll bring the kids to this clay cafe, and then do they have to start toiling the dishes after they come out of the clay cafe? So really, I said it's not really a problem at all, because we'll go through this carefully, but simply there, both the customer is a yid and the shopkeeper is a yid. It's got kosher workers, doesn't matter. Now, to explain a little bit more, this mug made of clay does not need to have tevilah. Tevilah only applies to metals and to glass, midrabanan. There's no chiyuv to tovel clay. Why do we tovel clay? In China, etc. We tovel it because of the glazing. Okay, but the raw product, so we say the mug which hasn't been painted at all doesn't need to be toveled. The yid buys it, paints it, doesn't need to be toveled. The Jewish owner takes it and glazes it, but it's made by a yid, so again doesn't need to be toveled. But even let's take what happens if it's a clay cafe owned by a non-Jew, which is very common. Would you need to be tovel the kalim? So let's read this carefully. We're looking in Siman Kufchof in Yehudadeya, that's in Tfilos Kalim. So one who buys, first sip, if you buy kalim, klei suda, that means dishes which you'd bring to the table or you work with the food, whether they are metal or zchuchis or glass, oy kalim hametzupim be'ovor mibifnim, or if they are coated with lead on the inside. It seems to have been a common usage of lead in those times. I hope not very common today. Even though they are new, need to be toveled in a mikveh or in a mayon. So coating of lead would make it's a klicheres coated with lead, needs to be toveled. Yesh oimrim the kalim amatzupim ve'ovor afilim bibifnim yitbel beloy bracha. Does the coating on the inside make it a chayav v'tvila? Sofik. Okay. So this is about over. We're going to talk about glass in a moment. Then we have another sif yud, as you can see. A Jew takes a piece of silver. He takes a mass of silver and gives it to a goyish artisan, a goyish silversmith. And he says, make for me a becher. So now, who owns the becher? Is it a keli shenasa? Is it Yisrael or is it the worker? So the mechaber says, Eile tzorch tevila. A yid gives a goy a chunk of silver, and the goy makes it into a becher. The becher is called a shel Yisrael. It doesn't need to be toveled. The Ramo says v'yesh chelkin. There are those who disagree, and they should tovel without the bracha. What is the debate? And koine b'shvach keli. Does the craftsman have an ownership? If I take a bolt of cloth and give it to a tailor and tell him to make suits, does the tailor own the suits to some degree? But you can see he's taken cloth and made it into a suit. Does he have an ownership there? So some say ein umen keine b'shvach. It's not his. He's been going to be paid for his work, but he doesn't have ownership. And others say umen keine b'shvach keli, and that's what the Ramo is referring to. That there are those who would say the goyish silversmith has got an ownership on that becher because he took it from a piece of silver and made it into a cup. So he's got an ownership, and as a result, it's kli shel nochri, and therefore it should be toveled. And he doesn't say absolutely, it's a sofik. Okay, so now we've got that. This is our question. I've got this clay mug, and let's say the clay cafe is a goyish shop, and I give them now, and they glaze it. It's my mug, and they glaze it. So it's kli shel Yisrael, but they glazed it. So if you say that you could say that the glazing is considered an ownership of the goy to say it needs to be tefillah, needs to be table. All of this is we've missed one thing. How significant is the glazing process? So look at this. This is from the Dark Shuva, and he writes the following: that all of this, when we say that coated with lead is chayav v'tvila, that's when it's a proper coating. Avol biglazirt l'chud, just glazing, even it's glazing from both sides. He says tovel it without a bracha. So glazing doesn't make it into a glass keli, but on a suffix, yeah. Then he gives a reference to the Sefer Zer Zohar on the Isser V'Heter, and he says glazirt eine bichlal mitzupa be'over. Glazing is not the same as coated with lead. Ve'ein shum svore sheyevorech al tvila. No thought of having to toy would make it a tvila with a bracha. Chado. First of all, the glazing, he says, is a mixture of sand and lead, and the majority is sand, and therefore, I'm not sure it's a name. Therefore, it's not a chayav b'tvila, and also it's not even made in a kiln. I'm not sure about the details. What I do know is that the late Rav Padve, so he was of the opinion that china dishes do not need to be tabled. So all of us were brought up that china dishes do need to be taken to a mikvah. His personal view was like the more lenient, that the glazing is not considered it's not considered glassware and doesn't need to be toveled. And therefore, I'm going to use here two things. I go to a Goisha clay cafe, and they glaze it for me and give it back to me. So according to the Mechaber, Eino Tzorach Tvila, because it's Kli Shel Yisrael. Even according to the Ramo, who says who says that glazing bichlal is the mechayev tvila. So I've got here what we'd call a sfek in din drabonon. It's for sure in din drabonon because tvila of glass is a din drabonon, and therefore you got here sfek in a din drabonon. For sure, you can say it's not a problem. Right. Let's move on. I saw someone put something on the chat somewhere. I'm not sure where. So apologize. I'm not responding because it's disappeared. Right, let's move on. Number 6. Difficult question. Actually, a couple of people asked me this recently about putting on tefillin with a man who suffers from incontinence, and you go nearby, it's very uncomfortable to be nearby. Person in their own condition, there's a teva. Apparently, there's a teva that after a few minutes of an offensive smell, you just get used to it. It kind of switches off. That's how people are able to work in fish shops. After the first 5 minutes, kind of the teva switches off. It doesn't bother you anymore. So that's probably how these people manage. But objectively, it is a badly smelling situation. So what we've seen here from the Sefer Nishmas Avram, a Sefer on medical issues relating to halacha, he says that if a person whose clothes are soiled, even with urine, and it smells bad, they wouldn't be allowed to put on tefillin, and even without a bracha, and not that they wouldn't be allowed to learn Torah, wouldn't be allowed to say bracha, and until things are changed. Now, just to explain this a little bit more, it says in the Torah about when they eat, you should have when you're traveling, you should have a tool that when you relieve yourself, that you should cover it up, because the divine presence is in your camp, that Hashem should not see something shameful and back out of your camp. This is understood in La Halacha that if there is something which is shameful, repulsive, that is kivyochel pushing away the presence of the Shekhinah. And it goes, so let's say if a person did daven Shemona Esrei or said a bracha in the immediate presence of human feces and it's got a smell, they would have to say that bracha again. They would have to daven Shemona Esrei again. They would not be yoitzer. You're not yoitzer, even b'diavad. if you said that bracha. So what this person is going to do is one thing, but the visitor wants to come to put on tefillin with him. So the guidance, I told him that he wouldn't be able to put on tefillin with the person in this condition, unfortunately. Right. It's interesting. Now, as I'm speaking about, can the person do themselves? Now, if we take this view, what I've said, that the person doesn't sense the smell, possibly he would be able to put on tefillin because the smell doesn't bother him. That's an interesting question something to look into. Right, let's move on. A question, the following. So this is two questions, one after the other, which are going to from a young lady who has been training as a lactation advisor, which means to advise women who have given birth and how to cope with better to produce milk to be able to feed the baby. Now, the wisdom in the ethics of this schooling of this education is that the mother's milk is much better for the child's development rather than other milks, whether soya or other milks, rather than. And so, number one, there is they do exist milk banks, which means women have produced milk and then put it in a bank, and you can get that milk to feed your child. I don't know whether it's for money or free. I have no idea. But just asking the question, I've got this child who the mother's milk is not sufficient for whatever reason. Should we advise them to use from the milk bank, which is going to be mostly goyim, or should we advise them to compromise on the optimum development of the child, to compromise on that by giving them for other formula? And so we we all know the story of the Moshe Rabbeinu, that when the Bisyor gave him to a Egyptian nurse to suckle milk, and he refused. So there, the lashon is the mouth, which is going to be speaking with the Shekhinah, should suckle from a ochris. I think that's the lashon. But there, you could say that's the physical action of sucking. But what about who says the milk is the problem? And really, yes, this is the Ramah. This is Ramah in Siman Pei Aleph in Yeredeya. Cholav kusis gecholav Yisrael. Milk from a non-Jewish woman is the same as just as kosher as the milk from a Jewish woman. Nevertheless, one should not give a child to suckle from a mitzris. Mitzris is just for political reasons they use mitzris, because it was 1,000 miles away from Krakow. If there's a Jewish nurse available, wet nurse, so then should not use from a mitzris. Because the milk from the Ivedes Kechovim is going to cause blockage of the sensitivity of the heart in Avodas Hashem, and would cause a teva, an evil nature. For that matter, a woman was a menekes, who is a wet nurse, should not be eating dvorim asurim and giving it to, then feeding the child. He calls them mazik loy beziknusa, amazing stuff. That it could be years later, could be decades later, and the fact that they had milk which had in it non-kosher input could cause a spiritual damage many years later even. So therefore, despite the optimum preference for mother's milk from the milk bank, the reaction is no, we wouldn't go that way, and would have to compromise on that mile of mother's milk and give formula or whatever would be. So here's then the hemshich to that is another question. As I say, the ethics of this group is that mother's milk is the best thing for the child rather than anything else. Now, what would happen if a child is not getting not putting on weight adequately. So you could say, well, that supplement is not getting enough milk from the mother. You supplement with formula. Or do you say, just leave it, give it a couple of weeks, the child will pick up more strength and they'll have the mother's milk. Because once you start putting other stuff in, it somehow diminishes the input of the mother's milk. Don't ask me more details because I don't know. But see, here's the question. If it would be a girl, the advice would be, according to her, all right, so give it another couple of weeks. She'll don't worry. She'll put on weight 2 weeks later. So what? But here's a boy, and because the boy's underweight, they can't do the bris. So would it be what would be the advice to would it be correct to start compromising on the quality of the milk and giving the child the formula in order to make the bris on time or sooner? So this is from this Sefer Sokimot Shavas, and he quotes one source one should do whatever one can to get the bris to happen on the 8th day. And then he has in skulas, various skulas, putting golden items on the child. Then we have, one says, wash the child negelwasser 3 times. That's going to make a difference. And then there are those who use a blue lamp to get down the jaundice. Then some say put the child in sunlight. That it should be the baby's belly should be exposed to sunlight, but he says make sure to cover the eyes and not leave the child too long. And then some say overfeed the child, and others say, well, actually, not to feed the child would actually help to reduce the jaundice. Some say vitamin E. Then this is I can't make this up. Some say that if you put the child in a bath together with fish, particularly carp, it's very helpful to reduce the jaundice. He does say you should take the advice from a Rov and a doctor who know what they're talking about. Then he brings from a Sefer Imrei Mordechai, who says there's no chiyuv to do all of this stuff. Of course, when there's a mitzvah to be done, you have to prepare and make sure to help it to happen. But there's no chiyuv to change the Mezuzos and the nature. And indeed, shave al taisa, or better abstain from all of these shtick. B'shagom, there are those who say that some of the methods mentioned before could be harmful to the health of the child. So here we have mitzad echad. We have those who say that you should do shtick to make the bris earlier, and others take a more I don't know, take a different view. They say just relax, and it'll happen when it'll happen in due course, and you don't have to start doing all these interventions, which may actually have side effects which are undesirable. Someone asks that about known that someone has used pigeons to get rid of jaundice. That is true, and has worked on adults. I don't know whether that was used for little children, for little boys to get the bris on time. Apparently, there is this thing of using pigeons, putting on the belly of the jaundiced patient, and the pigeons absorb the jaundice, and they die, but I don't know whether that was used for little children. And again, are you a mechuyev to do such a thing, or can you just say let nature take its course, and we'll do the bris bismanoi, which means bismanoi when Hashem wants it to happen. Okay, let's move on. So these are 2 questions about the ethics in relation to lactation. Can you discard a used menorah? So after Hanukkah, you've got these tinny menorahs, and what can you do? What can you do? Can you put it straight in the bin? So, for that matter, some of us have got these little glass inserts which sit on inside the cups. These glass cups sitting inside the silver cup, and they don't last very well. Some of them are actually so flimsy they can't be used more than a couple of times. So he says these you're allowed to throw them into the bin. However, there are those who say that if it's visible on the article that it was used for a mitzvah, as in those little cups, and certainly a Chanukiah, which is the modern Hebrew word for menorah, lo yizerkem b'birzoya, not to cast them away. You think about last week you used it for a mitzvah, you were so happy to do a mitzvah with it, and now it's in the bin. There's a certain insensitivity about that. So if you want to discard them, yes, wrap them in a bag and discard them in that way. It's more respectful rather than them being together with the fish bones and whatever the leftover cholent beans, etc. And actually, the same thing would be for old Shabbos candlesticks. Again, it's an article used for a mitzvah, and therefore it can be discarded. It's not shameless; it can be discarded, but it should be done with a certain degree of respect. And so, wrapping it up and then putting it in the waste, that would be acceptable. Let's go on to the next point, and that is about, someone asked me just on Thursday, does gluten-free bread have a problem of bishul akum? Apparently you can buy gluten-free bread from national bakeries, Warburton's, whatever, and it's got a hechsher of some sort, but that hechsher doesn't mean pas Yisrael. Okay, so if it's a wheat or bar or spelt, then of course it's an issue of pas Yisrael, and you wouldn't use those products. So they give a hechsher for those people who are otherwise would use kosher bread mamish, so they give a hechsher that doesn't have any treif ingredients. But he's asking, what about if it's a gluten-free? Generally, gluten-free means it's made from other flours, not from wheat or barley or spelt or rye or oats. It's made from tapioca. It's made from some other types of starches, rice flour. So does that come into the din of pas akum or bishul akum? So let's read this carefully. This is from Siman Kufyud Beis. You've got two simonim in Shulchan Aruch here today at the beginning of Chet Beis. Kufyud Beis is about pas akum. Kufyud Gimel is about bishul akum. Says the Mechaber right at the beginning, V'lo yosru ela pas shel chameshes minei dogon. The Isur of pas nochri refers to bread made from one of the 5 grains, aval patzal kitnis, but bread made from beans, or from rice flour, millet flour, eino bichlal pas stam she'ostru. So gluten-free bread, assuming it's made not from one of the 5 grains, then it does not have a problem of pas akum. Comes along the Ramo and he says, V'gam einei osur mishum bishulei goyim, im einoi oilal shulchan malachim. If it's not oilal shulchan malachim. So now I've got the question to you. Is regular bread oilal shulchan malachim? Is regular bread, I mean, I've never been inside Buckingham Palace, but I imagine that for 11s or whatever, there's going to be slices of bread, and there's going to be perhaps some honey, and with tea perhaps, but it's oilal shulchan malachim. The sliced bread and my sliced bread is the same thing. So it's oilal shulchan malachim. So I'm going to ask you a fundamental question, fundamental yachasit, yeah? You say that bread, there's a heter. If you don't have if there's no palta yisrael, no Jewish bread available, there's a heter to use bread from a goysha bakery. I'm talking about the ingredients are just flour and water and salt. They don't use any treif fats, so like the French baguette. Okay, but if it's oilal shulchan malachim, so never mind. It's not pas akum, so it's bishul akum. If you're telling me that bread, okay, if it doesn't fall into the category of pas, but you still have to be worried about bishul akum, because bishul akum doesn't mean necessarily it was cooked in water, because if it made edible through through other forms of let's say baking, baked is also called bishul akum. If you bake, if a guy baked, I don't know, shepherd's pie, assuming the shepherd's pie is Ola Shulchan Malachim, just a steer mineo bay, so that's for the shepherds, but assuming it's Ola Shulchan Malachim. So then, what's the difference? Baked or cooked? A guy made food, took raw food, made it edible, it's geschmack, and it's presentable, it's choshev. So then it's going to be bishul akum. So what's the bread? So how do you deal with this? So actually, some Meforshim say, no, bread is not Ola Shulchan Malachim per se. Shulchan Malachim means a choshev of food, as in a nice cooked food. And bread doesn't fall into that category. And therefore, stam bread doesn't have a question of bishul akum. It's only pas. So what's the Ramah saying? If a rice bread, he says like this: if this rice bread has been seasoned with certain spices, somehow it's been made more fancy than regular bread, then it could be a question if it's oil al shulchan malachim. But plain bread made from wheat, or plain bread made from rice, is by that is not called oil al shulchan malachim. It's not called a choshev of food. It's a staple food, but not a choshev of food, and therefore there's not going to be a problem of bishul akum. So that's the new insight, that bread is, by its very definition, by default, it's eino yoel al shulchan malachim, and therefore there's no question of bishul. Could be an exceptional type of bread made in a more fancy way, then it could actually be a problem of bishul akum, which the Ramah raises that problem. Right, one last thing, and that is, I had a few feedbacks on pronouncing Hashem's name, Aleph Hey Yud Hey, and one of them was to the website of Rav Broin, soll sein gesund, the Rav in Crown Heights. He has a very good website called Ask the Rav, and he had on this very question about uttering the Shem, is it Eye or Echye or Eke? So he mentioned the Sikha, which I mentioned last week, where the Rebbe brings a horror from Reb Chaim Vital that you can pronounce it normally, but then he brings from Mokim Makoris and Nigla in Halacha to avoid it. And as I mentioned last week, that I remember hearing the Rebbe pronouncing it with a kuf rather than pronouncing it in the regular way. And just to finish off, I mentioned also last week about the story with the Tzemach Tzedek and the Ruzhana, that Eryeh is 21, and times Eryeh is 441, and that's Gematria Emes. And so this word was repeated by, this is on the screen, it's sent to me by Rabbi Binyamin Singer, up in Bury in Manchester. And this is from a sefer called Tzohar Lateva from, I think, Rav Moshe Moskowitz, who lives in Chicago. And he brings here, B'Shem, one of the Gerer Rebbes, that we have in the Piyut. We have a Piyut on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. We call it V'chel Maminim. In Arizal refers to it, the Piyut Ha'oiches B'yad Midas Mishpat. Arizal says to be careful not to tamper with it. It's a very meduyak piyut. At any rate, so it says there, we say, curiously, we say it staggered. We say the dalad and the hay, etc., rather than saying dalad and dal and hay and hay. That's another discussion. But meanwhile, we have, as we say it, the minig ha'olam is v'chol ma'aminim shodayin emes hehogu b'eya she'eya. So you see here that you got the emes and eya she'eya come together. So that was the message which the Ruzhana and the Tzemach Tzedek had said, that when Moshe was sent to Paray, Hashem told him, to Yidden, to send to etc., to zog in the emes, and with midos emes, that will break through and reach where you have to. Mention perhaps also that Chosoma shel Kodesh Baruch Hu emes. Hashem's seal is emes. Emes is the first letter and the last letter of the Aleph base and the middle letter. But bear in mind, middle letter is only when you have 27 letters. Mem being the middle letter is only when we have 27 letters. In other words, we have a double chof, a double mem, and double nun, double pei, and double tzadik, man sepach. Then you got 27 letters. So then the ois mem is actually the middle letter of those 27 letters. With that, I'll wish you a gute Woche, and we should hear Besudas Tovis, Besudas Hagula with Eliyahu Novi, so Mavasad Yavasad Toiv, and Gula Shleim with Moshiach Tzidkenu b'Meher Yameinu Mamish.
Well,